Greetings to all in this United Board webinar. This is part of the series on leading in crisis. We know that leading our institutions is always stressful and challenging. It demands much of us as leaders, but especially in the pandemic, in the crisis we're going through, when we're all navigating something new. We don't exactly know how everything will work out. This is especially very stressful. And so this is really for us to share. For me, I just take the lead for us to share of uh, what are the inner resources, especially that we have. I speak of spirituality, but it really is about the inner resources that we seek in order to be able to lead during this time and to lead, especially with faith and courage. I started by going through some of the surveys of United Board institutions about what we are going through, and we're pretty much sharing the same concerns, anxieties and concerns. All our institutions experience some admissions and revenue drops, some not so bad, and others much more challenging. We worry about the job market for our graduates because really the economic world is changing very much. And on a more practical side, teaching online demands connectivity problems for students and our teachers. I myself am teaching three courses during this first semester in the Philippines, and especially challenging for my course in advanced calculus for my students there. And of course, we worry about the formation of our students. We know that so much depends on student life, and we have to provide support for our faculty and staff. And we know that while we experience difficulties made outside our universities, there are many communities in desperate need. Here in the Philippines, aside from the pandemic, we have had some terrible typhoons, which have devastated huge areas of our country. So many people in need. When we look, though, at the beginning of the academic year, when I look at the second set of surveys, I saw that we are focusing on managing these problems. We still have anxieties and concerns, but I think we're really now trying to see what we can do to make progress on these problems. But we continue to be in a time of anxiety and stress. I mentioned the typhoons and rains in the Philippines, and one thing that happened to a young school administrator was that she did not call off classes immediately, and she was shocked at the barrage of criticism and attack from uh, parents, especially students, and so on. What happens is that people are anxious and stressed, and in time of anxiety and stress, reactions like anger are amplified or amplified. And unfortunately, we as leaders can be their targets. They're not really that angry with us, but they're just angry, and they need to vent, and we become an easy target for them. Our Jesuit founder, St. Ignatius, said, this always struck me. He said that one of the things leaders need is we need to have the strength to carry the weaknesses of many. Of course, our weaknesses too, but we also have to carry the weaknesses of many. And so I think we need to reflect on this burden that we are carrying now and may have to carry for some time in the future. Because the situation is likely to go on for some years. Of course, vaccines are coming. We're optimistic. But for most of our countries, it will not reach us really till the end of 2021. And given all the logistics and the finances and so on, it may take 2 or 3 years to reach what we call a herd immunity in our communities. And even then, we cannot prevent new waves that happened in previous pandemics. Moreover, the loss of jobs and economic impact cannot be reversed so easily. Some companies have closed permanently. And so we have to be prepared for heightened stress for our students, our parents, our faculty, and others, our communities, for a few years, at least for a few years. And so the question we face is what resources can we turn to carry these burdens, our own burdens, and to carry the fears and anxieties of our community? Where do we turn? I'd like to begin by sharing my own experience of leading in a time of heightened stress. This was in the 70s and 1980s. I became dean of the Ateneo de Manila College, relatively young dean, I was 32, in the time of martial law on the right and revolutionary groups on the left. We suffered restrictions on student organizations. There was military surveillance of our campus. I assumed that my office was bugged and that the phones were tapped. Media was taken over by the martial law government. But those were difficult for us. But the greatest suffering was really among the poor. Demolitions of squatter houses, arrests of farmers and workers who were suspected of being with rebel groups. And many of them were friends because we had been working with them for many years. It was also a time when the church called for us to care for the poor. The phrase at that time was a preferential option for the poor. And so we were called to be with those who were really the major victims of martial law and others in need. And so, as Dean of the Ateneo College, I asked our faculty and our students to do what we can to be with them. At the very beginning of my term, I gave an address called The Ateneo in the Service of the Nation. And I said that the nation, especially, are the majority poor who suffer the most during this martial law period. But I said we would follow the Christian Gospels and nonviolence because there are also violent revolutionary groups on the left. So this put us in tension. We're caught in between the martial law right and the revolutionary left. So it was stressful. I had to lead under stress. I did have, because we said for our students to really care, they have to spend time with the poor. So we organized what we call immersion programs where they would spend a week. Now, maybe just 2 or 3 days, but at that time, they spent a week with farmers in the rural areas. And I did have some sleepless nights worrying about how they would be, although we took precautions and we had people watching actually over them. But still, I was concerned. And yes, there were some difficult encounters on the ground with the military or rebel groups. And in 1978, our students were protesting cheating in a controlled election, cheating in a controlled election. And the student council was arrested together with other leaders, but the students were released soon. But still, it was a shock. And in 1980s, some staff of our Office of Social Concern, who were the ones most directly involved in student formation, they were arrested, and some were released soon, but many were detained for a few months. But although it was a difficult situation and stressful, I look back to it and we came out well from the crisis. Uh, it took 14 years, 1986, when finally the dictatorship was toppled and the end of martial law came. But we look back to that period uh, with some sense of fulfillment because despite the difficulties, we played a significant role in the final years that led to the end of the dictatorship. Um, just to tell you what it was like in those years, someone asked me later, so what changed for you when finally Mr. Marcos left and you're back to democracy? Well, I said maybe the main thing is that I no longer worry that my office or my phone is tapped and I can now talk freely. So they were a bit surprised, but it showed you, I guess, that it was a stressful situation. What helped me during that crisis? Uh, First, care for self. Uh, Stress takes its toll on us physically. And so I always made sure to exercise and to have enough sleep and make sure that I was in good physical shape. I I jog around campus almost daily, almost daily. I found sanctuary in prayer, in my tradition, the tradition of my order, the Jesuit order. We asked to spend an hour in prayer every day. I do not always make it, but I try. I spend time every morning. This was my sanctuary. Uh, and there were some particularly difficult times, like when the students were arrested, and I would spend the whole Sunday morning and pray and express my fears and anxieties. It helped to be able to express my fears and anxieties in that time of quiet and prayer. What else helped me in those times? Really, the young people and the faculty I work with. In a sense, I carried them, but they carried me too. We carried each other. Something we always used to tell each other is that fear begets fear, but courage also begets courage. Maybe because they're young, they were really very courageous. And of course, our dream of helping create a better future for our farmers and workers. And we really cared for each other. That sustained us through those times. So now, looking at our crisis, what is this crisis we're going through? Of course, it is a health crisis, and we're worried because they're overwhelming our hospitals. We feel the pain of loved ones who pass away, and we cannot even be there with them. There is much pain and much death. I'm saying quite a few wake masses for friends who have died. No? But we have hope of relief with the advent of vaccines. However, we know that first, it will take another couple of years to reach herd immunity, and it may continue to return in waves. And of course, there is the economic crisis. Many lost jobs in the Philippines, many families hungry. Hunger has spiked. Businesses are closing, and there are political crises. We see this most obviously in the United States, no? But it's happening in many other countries. A lot of political crisis, and we don't know the end of it yet. But what universities are for the future. We are for the future. And so I do not think, I think we cannot just think of the present crisis. We should also begin to think that the post COVID 19 world may be quite different. The greatest pandemic of all was the Black Plague in the 14th century, uh, which returned in waves and actually killed half the population of Europe. I was very struck reading a book by a historian, Barbara Tuchman. And at the end of the book, she pointed out that the world had changed. The nobility had weakened, the church had weakened, uh, and at the end of that pandemic came eventually the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. Out of that tragedy, modern Europe emerged. I do not know if the post COVID 19 world will be so dramatically different, but we're already seeing that the future work world will be different for our students. We already see that some businesses are prospering and others are going down. We know clearly that industries will go more and more into automation to protect themselves from uh, a problem like this in the future, but that will threaten the jobs for so many of our graduates. So, as universities, we must think of the future. We know we are dealing with a health crisis, but we know that it has tremendous and probably long-term economic, political, and cultural uh, impact. So beyond online learning concerns, which of course we have to worry about a lot because we have to educate our students, we have to begin to discern the future for our students. They are likely to be living in a different future, a different world. And that future will not reveal itself immediately. It will take time. I was very struck by an interview with Melinda Gates. As you know, the Gates Foundation has been very focused on things like pandemics. And Melinda said that we had actually thought of the possibility of a virus pandemic, but we never foresaw the economic impact. So there will be probably other consequences that will only come out over time. And so we, as leaders of educational institutions, have to continue to discern the future, which will unfold over a long period. And so this will ask a lot of our inner resources. It will ask a lot of the resources of our spirit. And that is the area where I'm asked to share in a very special way with for you. Pope Francis, whom I read a lot, says that the basic rule of a crisis is this: you do not come out of it the same. If you get through it, he says, you come out better or you come out worse. but never the same. And he gives examples. So in this webinar, maybe we can reflect and share what will help us to come out better and help one another. I want to share with you about spirituality. It's really a language for turning to our inner resources, to the resources of our spirit. It's not the same as religion or religious faith, although religions and religious faiths have their traditions of spirituality. There are Christian spiritualities, there are Buddhist spiritualities, there are Muslim spiritualities, there are Hindu spiritualities. And I have some very good friends who are agnostics or non-believers, and I do see that they are very connected with their inner life and their inner resources. Spirituality is a way, I describe it as a way. It's a way of connecting to our inner self, to our inner spirit. Um, some talk about it as centering on the core of ourselves. It is a way that connects us to something or someone greater than ourselves. It is a way to meaning in life, to hope in difficult times. I think it's not easy to describe, but I think you understand what we mean by spirituality. I'd like to share with you, I wrote an article about this some years ago, talking about spirituality and the cost or the challenges of leadership. And I wrote that article as a dialogue between my religious tradition, my spirituality tradition, and a book of leadership guru, Ronald Kuyfetz. Two books he had, Leadership Without Easy Answers and Leadership on the Line. So from my Christian tradition, the Christian Gospels, in the Christian Gospels, Jesus says that suffering can often be a major part of our life. He says that whoever wishes to follow him must be ready to carry his cross, to accept suffering, and especially leaders. Knowing that for me has been helpful. I've learned to accept that, yeah, pain and suffering does come, but it is okay. We can we can find support for it. Ronald Heifetz says it this way. He says that leadership can be dangerous for a leader. Why? Because people give us, their leaders, power and authority, and in return, they expect us to solve their problems. And if the problems persist, if their hopes are frustrated, they can turn against us. There can be anger, criticism, attack, and for some, assassination. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others. So, what, how do we protect ourselves and how do we keep the strength to lead in such difficult times? We need time to withdraw, to pray, and to reflect. In my spiritual tradition, we call it being contemplative in action, being able to reflect while also being in the action world. So, in practice, this means for us that we are asked to do what we call a consciousness examen. We're asked to spend time each day, and in that time, we go back over the past 24 hours. We remember events, we remember people, we recall how we went through it. We recall feelings. Were we sad? Were we happy? Were we frustrated? So go through that and in a reflective way. Heifetz uses the image of being on the dance floor and getting on the balconies. So the dance floor is real life, and balcony is when we reflect. So we ask us to go back and forth. We are engaged in the reality of our work, leading and so on, and then we take time and withdraw and reflect. And in withdrawing and reflecting, we watch ourselves. We go back and we look back at ourselves and the others on the dance floor. And so it is a cycle of action and reflection. Why do we do that? We need to achieve some level of inner freedom, freedom from what I call the static, from the tensions within us, which can cloud our judgment and make it difficult for us to discern the correct path to the future. So on the balcony, we seek to see, to feel, and to understand what is going on the dance floor in the midst of the challenges we face. We need to silence our own needs, our fears, our desires, because they can block. because we need to see clearly and to feel how others feel. We have to be able, in a sense, to mute our feelings so that we can feel how others feel. So, in this cycle of being on the balcony and on the ground, we seek to understand our people. We need to feel with their fears and with their concerns. We are asked to share their hopes and their dreams. And feelings are important. We have to really grow in empathy and compassion. IFET says that when people go through difficult change, you take them on an emotional roller coaster. Hope, frustration, as they lose the familiar and navigate the new. Knowing, their knowing that we feel their pain and share their difficulties reassures them that we, their leaders, care. And because of that, we keep their trust. In my experience, people will accept to follow us in trust if they know that we understand them and we care for them. Moreover, I think again, as universities that are preparing young people for the future, citizens and leaders for the future, remember Pope Francis says that in a crisis, we do not come out the same. We come out better or we come out worse. We'd like to see that we and our students will contribute to coming out of this pandemic more caring and more compassionate. The world needs a more caring and more compassionate reality. Because why? There is so much suffering and pain around us, so much anxiety and distress. In the Philippines, so many lost jobs, so many hungry, so many who suffer through the typhoons, and you cannot even go out to reach out to them. And so we and our institutions are invited to be more caring and compassionate. Um, if we do that, we can help toward a better post-pandemic world. It will be a wonderful gift of this pandemic if we come out to a world that cares more for one another. And we begin. We do not begin with the big world. We begin in our institutions. We begin by caring for one another in our institutions. I want to talk about stress because sometimes many people think that stress is a purely psychological thing. I do want to stress to yeah to emphasize that stress is very physical and very physiological. There was an article in Scientific American some years ago that talked about what happens to us under stress. Um, the article was entitled "This is Your Brain in Meltdown." It points out that it reminds us that the neural circuits responsible for our self-control, emotional, physical self-control, they are highly vulnerable to even mild stress. And under extreme stress, they shut down. And when they shut down, primal impulses go unchecked, and we can have mental and emotional paralysis. It has these images. The unstressed brain, you see that thing that's a kind of blue-green. That's your frontal neocortex, which controls emotions, controls your thinking, makes sure that you make good judgments. It regulates everything by hunger, sex, aggression, emotional fear, as well as fear. And it connects to the rest of our body. It works very well if we are not stressed. Under stress, the frontal neocortex shuts down, and the emotional part, the limbic system, takes over, and it responds to stress. Um, it comes out with arousal chemicals, norepinephrine, dopamine. They shut off neuron firing. In other words, they shut off a lot of our system because they're designed to simply help us to run, to run. It removes our ability to regulate behavior. So what happens if your emotional brain takes over because of stress? You go to basic responses, fight or flight. You respond in anger, blaming, and so forth, fight, or you withdraw and avoid the problem, flight. Uh, This is probably rare, but it can happen. It can happen under extreme stress. So I want to emphasize that we need to manage stress. And I stress this. I'm sorry. I emphasize this because it's a very physical need. We need exercise, sleep, relaxation. In my experience, for example, there were times of very extreme stress. I was just, for example, when my secretary was arrested, picked up by a black limousine of the martial law government, I was really very angry and very stressed. And in order to control where I was, I just ran and ran and ran till I was exhausted. I was totally exhausted. Ran probably about an hour and a half. And that restored balance. And I was able to think clearly again. We need sleep, we need relaxation. We need to handle our emotions. Heifetz speaks of managing your hungers. Stress can really heighten our weaknesses. If we have need for power and control, we have need for our affirmation and reassurance, if we're prone to loneliness, all of this can be heightened under stress, and we can do things that we will regret later on. So what can you do? You need rituals, prayer, exercise, which disengage you from the fray and connect you to your inner self. And what I want to talk about most is to find your center. The center is in family, in friends, and in God or in your deepest beliefs. And so Heifetz speaks about anchors, and I really find this very helpful, and I've shared it with many. The most important for leaders, the most important anchor he gives is to distinguish role from self. We need anchors. As leaders, we will get praise. People say, "Good job, great, great going," but we will also get criticisms and attacks. I will get nasty letters or nasty comments. What is important is whether it's praise or it's blame. Remember, it is not really addressed to you personally. It is addressed to your role. People praise you or attack you. They praise you if they are happy with a decision you made or an action you did, or they might criticize you because they're upset. They did not like a decision you made or action you did. And so it's very, very important to seek sanctuary, to be able to go into our inner circle, into our inner self. The image I have is our life is that we live in concentric circles. The outer circle is our role. For me, president of Ateneo de Manila, I was also superior of the Jesuits. I work in the science world. I work in many things. And so I have many roles, but they are roles. They are not me. I always remind myself that that is not me. Career is not me. And what is really me closer is my inner self, where I am with family, with loved ones, with good friends, with God. Very important to know that and to retreat to it. So you need to seek sanctuary. This sanctuary may be a time for prayer in the early morning or at night. It may be people, the loved ones with whom you can simply be ourselves. We can complain, we can cry, we can just be ourselves, share our pain and joys also. It can be a place, a sacred place where everything calls us to put pressures aside and to be with ourselves, with loved ones, with God. So, why spirituality? It is an anchor. Spirituality anchors us. We were not designed to deal with so much stress, so we must compensate. The modern world is so much more difficult today. Difficult already in the past with social media, with this pandemic, it's even more difficult. And so we must compensate. We must protect ourselves, actually. We have to protect ourselves. So anchors are serious recognition that we need to care for ourselves in order to carry out our leadership well. We have to care for ourselves because if we did, we can, because we have to be okay and in good shape so we can care for others. It is really it's self-love if you wish, but it is a self-love that is necessary so we can love others and care for them. Very important to do that. So to end, this session is really to invite us to turn to a spirituality, whatever it is, or we may not call it a spirituality, but to be able to enter into our inner resources, to be able enter our center, in order to be able to turn to the anchors in our lives. And so to end, spirituality is what anchors us and holds us together amidst the demands and pressures of leadership, especially in this time. It gives us the inner freedom, the courage, and the vision to accept the cost of leadership, and it is especially demanding in this time. So we can carry on our mission in our universities of preparing a next generation of young people, even in this time of crisis. So this is my sharing with you, and it's an invitation to learn from one another, um, in a sense, to carry one another, so that we can carry also our communities and the young people we have, so that yeah, we will come out of this pandemic better, much better, more caring, more compassionate, more able to contribute to a better world. Thank you very much.